year 539 before our era, the most powerful army in the world entered the largest city that humanity had ever built. There was no battle. There was no resistance in the gates of Babylon, those bronze and lapis lazuli gates that the Babylonians themselves considered impossible to tear down, simply opened. The king was inside, celebrating a banquet. The legend says that that same night, a writing appeared on the wall that no one knew how to decipher. Hours later, the most powerful monarch of Mesopotamia was dead. That is how Babylon ended, not with a siege of years, not with hunger or catapults, with a party and a betrayal, and understanding how a city that dominated the world for 2,000 years reached that end requires going to the beginning, not to the beginning of Babylon, to the beginning of what it means to build an empire so large that you can no longer protect it from your own mistakes. Babylon was not born great. It was born as a small settlement in the plains of Mesopotamia between the Euphrates and the Tigris, in the territory that today occupies the center of Iraq. The first written records we have of this city date from around the year 2200 before our era, when it was just a minor town within the empire of Ur, the great Sumerian power of that moment. No one in that time would have bet on Babylon. It was a secondary city without its own mineral resources, without mountains to protect it, without direct access to the sea. What it had was water, fertile land, and a geographical position that with time turned out to be the most strategic in the known world. At the point where the Euphrates and the Tigris come closest to each other before separating towards the south, any merchandise that traveled between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf had to pass through the vicinity of Babylon. That was not luck, it was geography. And for 2 millennia, that geography was the base of everything that Babylon built. But geography alone does not build empires. For that, it took the type of mind that changes the rules of the game. That mind arrived in the form of a king named Hammurabi. And here is where you have to destroy what they probably taught you. If you heard about the Code of Hammurabi in school, almost certainly they told you that it was the first code of laws in history. That is incorrect. Before Hammurabi, there existed at least 3 sets of written laws in Mesopotamia. The Code of Ur-Nammu dated around the year before our era, that of Lipit Ishtar and the laws of Eshnunna. What Hammurabi did was not to invent the laws. What he did was something much more sophisticated. He created the first legal system designed explicitly as a tool of political control at an imperial scale, and that distinction changes everything. When Hammurabi came to power around the year 1792 before of our era, Babylon was one more city-state among dozens in the region. In less than 40 years, he turned it into the center of the known world. He did it through a combination of military conquest and something that his predecessors had not fully understood: bureaucracy as a weapon. His laws, the 282 provisions engraved on that black diorite stele that today rests in the LBG, were not primarily a justice system. They were an administration manual. They regulated prices, salaries, contracts, inheritances, property rights, responsibilities of doctors and architects. They regulated who could do what, with whom, under what conditions, and what happened to him. If he did not do it, Hammurabi did not want judges in every town. He wanted the citizens themselves to know exactly what were the consequences of every decision. That eliminates the need for constant supervision. That is an empire that works by itself. And there is something more in that code that is rarely mentioned. The 282 laws of Hammurabi include provisions that protected the weakest in a way that no previous legal system had done with that clarity. The law established that if a builder built a house that collapsed and killed the owner, the builder should die. If it killed the son of the owner, the son of the builder should die. That sounds brutal with modern eyes, but in the context of a society where the powerful could simply ignore the consequences of their negligence, that law was revolutionary. For the first time, responsibility before the law did not depend on the social status of the culprit. It depended on the act committed, That is a concept that took another 2,000 years to reappear in Western history with the same clarity. There are also provisions on minimum wages for different types of work, on the protection of widows and orphans, on the right of women to divorce in certain circumstances, on the regulation of interest rates on loans. The academic world has debated for decades if these laws were really applied or were rather a proclaimed ideal. What we do know is that there exist thousands of clay tablets with contracts and legal resolutions of the period of Hammurabi, which demonstrate that the system worked in daily practice. Babylon did not only have written laws, it had lawyers, notaries, and judicial archives. It had what today we would call a rule of law. Think about what it means to live in that city in its moment of greatest splendor under Hammurabi. You are in the central market, near the great temple of Marduk. The smell of dried fish from the Euphrates arrives, mixed with the aroma of spices that come from so far away that no one in your neighborhood would know how to point out where on a map. The noise is constant. Voices in Akkadian, in Sumerian, in languages that you do not recognize, because Babylon is already a crossroads where merchants from what is today Turkey, Iran, Syria, the Persian Gulf converge. The heat in the middle of summer is so dense that people work from dawn until the second hour of the morning and return to work at sunset, leaving the central hours of the day for the interior of the adobe houses. The city has irrigation canals that cross the neighborhoods like arteries, bringing water from the river to the private gardens and to the fields. Everything works. Prices are regulated. Contracts are fulfilled because they are written on clay tablets that serve as evidence before any court. There is a structure. There is a logic, and that logic is what makes people want to live here and not in any other place in the known world. But what makes Babylon especially fascinating under Hammurabi is not only the legal system, it is the economy that system made possible. The temples of Babylon were financial institutions, not metaphorically, literally. The Temple of Marduk lent silver to merchants in exchange for interest. It financed commercial expeditions. It functioned as a central granary, where farmers deposited part of their harvest and received credit. The priests were simultaneously religious administrators and capital managers, and the Code of Hammurabi regulated those loans. It established maximum interest rates of 20% annually for loans of silver and 33% for loans of grain. Any lender who charged more lost the right to recover even the original capital. That in an economy of the second millennium before of our era sophisticated financial regulation, the concept of illegal usury was not invented by the medieval church, it was invented by Babylon. The result of all this was an economy of unprecedented complexity in the ancient world. There exist documents of the period of Hammurabi that record transactions with financial instruments that anticipate modern concepts. Commercial partnership contracts with sharing of profits and losses. Rudimentary insurance for commercial expeditions. Letters of credit that allowed trading without physically moving the metal. Babylon was not only the largest city of the ancient world, it was also, in terms of its economic sophistication, the most advanced. And then Hammurabi died, and the long process that historians call the decline of the Paleo-Babylonian period began. Empires do not die suddenly. They die in layers. And the first layer that deteriorated in Babylon was the one that always deteriorates first. The succession of power. The successors of Hammurabi were not incompetent. They were simply normal. And in a system built around the genius of an individual, normality is not enough. For more than a century, the kings who followed Hammurabi maintained the state, but did not expand it. The external pressures began to accumulate. The Kassites pressured from the Zagros to the east, the Hittites from the north, and around the year 1595 before of our era, the Hittite king Mursili I did something that no one expected. He marched his army through more than 1,000 kilometers of hostile territory, crossed the Euphrates and sacked Babylon. He did not stay. The sacking was opportunistic, not a planned conquest. But when he left, he took with him the statue of Marduk, That may seem like a detail. It was not. The statue of Marduk was the symbolic guarantee of the legitimate power of any Babylonian king, the New Year festival, the most important ceremony of the religious and political calendar of Babylon, required that the king literally took the hand of the statue of Marduk to renew his divine mandate. Without the statue, there was no ceremony. Without the ceremony, there was no mandate. A king of Babylon without the statue of Marduk was like a modern president without a constitution. He remained there physically, but his legitimacy was in doubt. And then the Kassites arrived, that people of origin that historians still debate with probable roots in the Zagros Mountains, who took advantage of the chaos to install themselves on the throne and stay for 4 centuries. 4 centuries. Babylon continued to exist. It continued to be important, but it was not she who commanded. It was an occupied city that maintained its culture while others made its decisions. And here is something that general history books rarely say. The Kassites did not destroy the Babylonian culture. On the contrary, they adopted Akkadian as an administrative language. They maintained the legal system of Hammurabi, rebuilt temples, boosted trade. In some senses, the Kassite period was an era of notable stability for the region, precisely because the new rulers understood that Babylon was worth more as a cultural brand than as a conquered territory. They did not try to Babylonize it in their image, they Babylonized themselves. That in terms of imperial administration is a strategy of considerable intelligence. But 400 years of Kassite government produced also a stagnation. And when the Assyrian Empire emerged as the dominant force of Mesopotamia in the first millennium before of our era, Babylon found itself in a position that it already knew, being the most important city in the world, governed by people who were not of it. The Assyrians conquered Babylon several times and treated it in radically different ways in different moments, which reveals something fundamental about how empires calculate the value of what they conquer. At the beginning, the Assyrian kings maintained Babylon as a special city within their domain. They understood that their religious and cultural legitimacy in Mesopotamia depended on Babylon recognizing it. So they adopted the title of King of Babylon and allowed the city to maintain its institutions. It was an implicit recognition that there were cities that you could not simply absorb. You had to negotiate with their identity. That negotiation lasted until a Babylonian king, supported by the Elamites of the east, rebelled against the Assyrian domain. The response of the Assyrian king Sennacherib was the most extreme that can be documented in the history of the ancient world. In the year 689, before of our era, he ordered the total destruction of Babylon. His own chronicles, preserved in cuneiform tablets, describe it with a coldness that still impresses. He ordered the temples to be demolished. The ruins flooded and the resulting dust dispersed. The texts say that he devastated the city more completely than a flood and that he mixed its remains with the earth. Babylon, the city that had existed for more than a millennium and a half, was wiped off the map. The ancient world was shocked. This was not simply the destruction of a city, it was a sacrilege of almost incomprehensible proportions. Babylon was the religious center of all Mesopotamia. Its gods were the gods of the region. Destroying its temples was declaring that the divine order could be violated with impunity. And although Sennacherib built an alternative theology that attempted to justify that act, the reaction was of generalized horror among the peoples of the region, even among the Assyrians themselves. His son Esarhaddon, barely 12 years later, began the reconstruction of the city. The political guilt was unbearable. What happened next is one of the most revealing episodes of all ancient history. Esarhaddon rebuilt Babylon not because he was a more pious man than his father, but because the destruction had turned out to be a strategic error of the first magnitude. The rebellion in the Mesopotamian provinces increased after the destruction. It did not diminish. The message that Sennacherib sent was not the one he intended. It was not "we are invincible." It was "we are capable of destroying the most sacred." And that does not generate obedience. It generates silent hatred that seeks the first opportunity to express itself. This is the first lesson that Babylon offers about power. A city can survive conquest much better than an empire. Because cities are cultures, empires are administrative structures, and structures break, cultures remain. The grandson of Sennacherib, Ashurbanipal, continued the reconstruction and ruled over an Assyrian empire that at that moment was the most extensive that the world had known until then. It spanned from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from the Mediterranean to the Zagros Mountains. It was an extraordinary work of political engineering. Ashurbanipal built in Nineveh the largest library of antiquity. More than 30,000 cuneiform tablets with texts of all the traditions of the ancient world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest epic poem that we preserve. We know it thanks to that library. Ashurbanipal had it copied and preserved. He was, in modern terms, a statesman who understood soft power before that concept existed. But even Ashurbanipal could not solve the fundamental problem of the Assyrian Empire. It was too large to govern with the communication and transport technologies of the era. A messenger on horseback took weeks to cross the empire from end to end. The decisions of the center arrived late to the provinces. The rebellions in the periphery were difficult to suppress before they consolidated, and when Ashurbanipal died, those tensions accumulated during decades exploded suddenly. The Assyrian Empire collapsed in less than 20 years, between the year 612 and the year 605 before of our era. It was one of the fastest falls of an established power in ancient history. Nineveh was destroyed by a coalition of Medes and Babylonians in the year 612. The city that had replaced Babylon as the center of the world took less than 2 decades to disappear, and it was precisely Babylon who filled the void. Because the ideas of Hammurabi, the religious traditions of Marduk, the culture that had accumulated for centuries, all that was intact in the collective memory of its people. Although the buildings had been destroyed and rebuilt several times, a city that lives in the mind of its inhabitants does not need walls to survive. The man who turned that return into something spectacular was Nabopolassar, a governor of Chaldean origin, that is, of the Semitic peoples who inhabited the south of Mesopotamia, who took advantage of the Assyrian collapse to proclaim himself king of Babylon in the year 626 before of our era. Nabopolassar was not a genius of war. He was a skillful politician who knew how to read the moment. When empires collapse, the strongest does not win. The fastest in filling the void with a convincing narrative wins. And the narrative of Nabopolassar was simple and powerful. Babylon has recovered its legitimate place in the order of the world. Marduk has chosen this new king. Everything else is a consequence. His son Nebuchadnezzar II is the one who built the city that the world remembers, and the speed with which he did it is in itself one of the most astonishing facts of antiquity. In less than 40 years, between the year 605 and the year 562 before of our era, Nebuchadnezzar built the largest city that the ancient world had ever seen. The outer walls of Babylon had a length of more than 80 kilometers. The city occupied an area of around 8 square kilometers within its inner walls. The most conservative estimates place the population at 150,000 people. The broadest reached 250,000. To give a reference, in that same moment, the city of Rome, which 5 centuries later would be the capital of the Western world, had probably between 50 and 80,000 inhabitants. Babylon was between twice and 3 times as large as the future Rome at the moment of its greatest splendor. And the walls of Babylon were a work of engineering without precedent. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited the city in the 5th century before of our era, described an outer wall whose width allowed 2 chariots of 4 horses to pass in parallel on it. Archaeological excavations have confirmed that the inner wall measured between 6 and 7 meters in thickness at its base, and that the city had 8 monumental gates, each dedicated to a different deity. The defensive system also included an outer moat fed by the Euphrates. To conquer Babylon by force from the outside, you needed to overcome the river, the moat, the outer wall, the space between walls and the inner wall. It was practically impossible with the military technologies of the era. The Ishtar Gate, that structure of blue glazed ceramic with reliefs of bulls and dragons that is partially preserved, reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum of Berlin, was the north entrance to the city. But what you see in the museum is only the lower part. The original structure measured more than 14 meters in height. 14 meters of cobalt blue tiles shining under the Mesopotamian sun, flanked by walls decorated with more than 120 lions of ceramic in relief, representing Ishtar, goddess of war and love. When a foreign visitor arrived in Babylon through that gate, he walked along the processional way, an avenue of more than 200 meters flanked by walls of glazed brick with reliefs of lions. The intense blue color of lapis lazuli was at that time one of the most expensive materials in the world. Covering kilometers of urban walls with that color was a declaration of wealth so obscene and deliberate that no visitor could ignore it. The message was not subtle. It was exactly what it intended to be. A demonstration that this city existed in a category different from the rest of the known world. The center of the city was the complex of the Temple of Marduk, known as Esagila, which means an Akkadian house of the raised head. It was the religious, political, and economic heart of Babylon at the same time. And next to it rose the Edamananki, the great stepped tower, the ziggurat, which the Babylonian texts describe as the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. The estimates of its height vary between 70 and 90 meters. It was the tallest structure in Mesopotamia, and it is very probable that it is the origin of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, whose name in Hebrew Babel is simply the transcription of Babylon. The Jewish exiles who lived in this city saw that tower with their own eyes and turned it into the symbol of human arrogance that pretends to reach heaven. That a people who had been taken by force to that city took its most impressive monument and turned it into the symbol of the pride that precedes the fall says a lot about the cultural power of the conquered over the conquerors. And then there were the gardens, the hanging gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Here one must be honest about what we know and what we do not know, because the distinction matters. We do not have archaeological certainty that they existed exactly as tradition describes them. No excavation has found direct evidence of their location within the city. The most detailed descriptions come from Greek authors such as Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, who wrote centuries later and probably never saw them in person. The most plausible explanation that modern researchers consider is that there was a confusion with the gardens of the Assyrian king, Sennacherib and Nineveh, which are much better documented archaeologically and whose description coincides in many details. Another historian, Stephanie Dalley of Oxford, has argued for decades that the gardens were in Nineveh and that the confusion occurred because Sennacherib called Nineveh the New Babylon in some of his texts. Be that as it may, the fact that for 2 millennia the world located them in Babylon and not in another city says something about the position that Babylon occupied in the imagination of the ancient world. It was the place where wonders had to exist, and that is a type of power that armies cannot conquer. But there is something about Nebuchadnezzar that is completely documented and that is rarely mentioned with the same energy as his constructions. This same king who raised those wonders destroyed Jerusalem in the year 586 before of our era. He set fire to Solomon's temple, the most sacred building in the Jewish world, and took tens of thousands of Jews into exile in Babylon, in what is known as the Babylonian exile or the Babylonian captivity. The estimates of the deported vary according to the sources. The book of Jeremiah mentions figures of around 4,600 people in 3 different deportations. Other calculations based on the conditions of the era raise that figure considerably. What is not in dispute is that the political, religious, and intellectual elite of Judah was displaced to Babylon. And what happened then was something that no political calculation could have foreseen. It was precisely in Babylon, far from their land, surrounded by the culture and the power of their conqueror, where the Jewish scribes and priests worked to codify in writing Much of what we know today as the Old Testament, texts that until then existed in oral tradition or in scattered written fragments, were compiled, revised and systematized during the period of the exile. Deuteronomy in its final form, the narratives of the books of Kings, the texts of the great prophets such as Ezekiel, who wrote literally from Babylon, all that took its definitive form in that period. The Psalms that lamented the loss of Jerusalem were written there. Psalm 137, which starts with the words, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept," was written by someone who was physically in Babylon, looking probably at the Euphrates. And there is something more. The prophetic texts of the period, especially the last chapters of the book of Isaiah, describe the future fall of Babylon with a detail and an intensity that speaks of a community that lived within that city and that saw its contradictions with very sharp eyes. Babylon in that literature is the archetype of the arrogant human power that believes itself eternal and that inevitably falls. That image of Babylon as a symbol of the corrupt power that deserves its destruction reached the book of Revelation, written in the 1st century of our era, where the Great Babylon is the name that the author uses for Rome. And since then, until today, Babylon functions in the Western religious and cultural imaginary as a synonym for unholy imperial power. That is what Nebuchadnezzar created without wanting to by deporting the Jews. He did not only move people, he moved a narrative that later inserted itself into the most influential religions of history, and that still today structures the way in which millions of people think about power, the fall and redemption. My opinion on Nebuchadnezzar, if it serves for something, is this. He was a construction genius and an extraordinary administrator who did not understand that the peoples whom he displaced were more resistant than his own walls. The Babylonians had been buried for centuries. The texts written in their captivity continue to be read by billions of people each week. There is an irony there that deserves to be contemplated in silence. But the kingdom that Nebuchadnezzar built depended on his own personal genius, and that is always the weak point of systems built around exceptional individuals. Nebuchadnezzar ruled 43 years and maintained the empire in expansion and order during all that time. He conquered Egypt, consolidated control over all of Mesopotamia, brought the Babylonian power until Cilicia in present-day Turkey. He was the most powerful ruler of the known world and also had moments of what the biblical texts describe as madness, episodes in which he would have lost his reason temporarily and lived like an animal in the fields. Some modern historians have speculated about diseases such as manic depressive psychosis or some type of political paralysis derived from extreme stress. The Babylonian texts are discreet about these episodes. The biblical texts describe them as divine punishment. What is documented is that his government ended normally with his death, and that what came after was disaster. In the 23 years that followed the death of Nebuchadnezzar, the Neo-Babylonian Empire had 4 kings. 4. The first was his son Amel-Marduk, who ruled 2 years before being overthrown in a coup d'etat. The second was his brother-in-law Neriglissar, a military general who ruled 4 years and died on campaign. The third was the teenage son of Neriglissar, who was assassinated after a few months. And the fourth was the man who closed the cycle of Babylon, the man whose name remained linked to the end of everything. Nabonidus. Nabonidus is one of the strangest and most fascinating characters of antiquity. He was a scholar, possibly the first systematic archaeologist in history in the strict sense. He ordered excavations in ancient temples to recover foundational inscriptions and restore sacred structures. He had a genuine intellectual curiosity for the past of Mesopotamia that would have made him an extraordinary academic in any other era. But he was also the king of Babylon, and those two identities could not coexist. His most serious error was theological. Nabonidus was devoted to the lunar god Sin, whose main cult was in Haran, the city where his mother had been born. That personal devotion led him to attempt to elevate Sin above Marduk in the official Babylonian pantheon. From the modern perspective, that seems like a minor religious dispute from the perspective of Babylon. In the 6th century, before of our era, it was equivalent to declaring that the constitution of the state was invalid. Marduk was not only the god of Babylon, he was the source of the political legitimacy of its kings. Taking away from Marduk his supreme position was taking away from the priests of Marduk their power, their properties, their income, and their social status, and the priests of Marduk controlled a huge economic network: farmland, grain warehouses, artisanal workshops, commercial networks. They were not abstract religious officials. They were the managers of a substantial part of the economy of the city. And then, Nabonidus did something even more disconcerting. He left, around the year 553 before of our era. The king of the most powerful city in the world left for the oasis of Tema in the Arabian desert and did not return for 10 years. He left the government in the hands of his son Belshazzar, who is the Belshazzar of the biblical texts as co-regent in Babylon. No one knows for sure why he did it. The theories go from commercial motivations, controlling the caravan routes of the desert, to religious reasons related to the cult of sin in Arabia, passing through a deliberate flight from the political tensions in the capital. The texts that we have are fragmentary and partial. What we do know is what happened during those 10 years of absence. The New Year festival of Marduk, the most important ceremony of the Babylonian calendar, could not be celebrated without the king present to take the hand of the statue of Marduk in the ritual. The ceremony was theologically invalid, and that festival was not just a ceremony. It was the moment in which the king renewed his divine mandate before his people. It was the act that legitimized his government for the following year. Without that act, the king of Babylon was, in religious terms, a usurper, and the Babylonian people, who lived in a system where religion and politics were inseparable, felt it in that way. 10 years without the New Year ceremony were 10 years of a government whose validity the religious system of the city itself put in doubt. The clergy of Marduk did not forget that. And when Cyrus II of Persia, the one that history knows as Cyrus the Great, advanced towards Babylon in the year 539 before of our era, many of those priests made the decision that seals the destiny of the city. They did not organize active resistance. Some historians go further and argue that they collaborated with the invader. The Cyrus Cylinder, an extraordinary document that the Persian conqueror himself had written after taking Babylon, describes his entry into the city in terms that are a whole manual of political propaganda. He says that Marduk, disappointed with Nabonidus, looked for a just king and found him in Cyrus, that it was the Babylonian god himself who guided the Persian conqueror to his city, that the taking of Babylon was not a conquest. It was a liberation authorized by the national god of Babylon itself. That text engraved on a clay tablet that today also is preserved in the British Museum is one of the most effective political propaganda documents that we preserve from antiquity. Cyrus did not arrive as a conqueror. He arrived as the candidate that the gods of Babylon themselves preferred. And for that narrative to work, he needed the priests of Marduk to back it, and they backed it. That night of October of the year 539, while the Persian army entered through the canals that connected the Euphrates with the interior of the city, the Prince Belshazzar celebrated a banquet in the palace. Nabonidus had returned from Tema years before and was outside the city, probably with part of the army. When the Persians arrived, the Book of Daniel, written centuries later and with clearly legendary elements, describes how that night a mysterious hand wrote words on the wall of the banquet hall that no one knew how to interpret until they called Daniel, the Jewish exile, who translated them as the divine sentence against the kingdom. That same night, the text says, Belshazzar was eliminated. The Babylonian sources confirm the fall of the city, but they are more sober in the details. What is certain is that Babylon was not destroyed. Cyrus entered without significant resistance. He ordered that the temples be respected. that the statues of gods that the Babylonians had brought from other cities be returned to their places of origin, that the deported of different peoples could return to their lands. The Jews in exile received permission to return to Judah and to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. That is documented both in the Cyrus Cylinder and in the biblical texts of the Book of Ezra. Cyrus did not liberate the Jews by abstract generosity. He liberated them because his imperial policy was the opposite of that of the Assyrians and the Babylonians themselves. Instead of displacing populations to weaken them, he returned them to their lands and built local loyalties. It was, in modern terms, soft imperialism. Babylon continued to exist after Cyrus. In fact, it continued to be the largest city of the Persian Empire and one of its main administrative centers for decades. When Alexander the Great arrived in the year 331 before of our era, he also entered without resistance. The city received him as they had received Cyrus, with relief and with the hope that the new power would respect its traditions. And Alexander did respect. To a great extent, he ordered the reconstruction of the Etemenanki, the great tower that had deteriorated. He had plans to make Babylon the capital of his new universal empire. He was 32 years old. He had conquered from Macedonia to the Indus and saw in Babylon the perfect geographical and cultural center for the world he wanted to rule. He died in Babylon in the year 323, before of our era. From a fever whose exact cause historical medicine still debates, he was 32 years old. With his death, the plans for Babylon died too. His generals divided the empire among themselves, and Babylon remained in the hands of the Seleucids, the dynasty that inherited the eastern part of Alexander's domain. The Seleucids built a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, about 40 kilometers from Babylon. And from that moment, the process was irreversible. The center of gravity shifted. Merchants followed power. Families went where the work was. Priests stayed as long as the temple had funding. And when funding decreased, they also migrated. The process lasted centuries. The last cuneiform tablets with Babylonian writing that we know date from the year 75 of our era, when the Roman Empire had already been the dominant power of the Mediterranean for more than a century. Someone somewhere near the ruins of Babylon continued writing in the oldest writing system in the world for more than 700 years after the Persians took the city. That detail, that anonymous persistence says more about the vitality of a culture than any monument. By the 2nd century of our era, Babylon was a field of ruins. The Roman geographer Strabo, writing around the turn of the era, already described it as a largely abandoned city. Nomads used its walls as building material. Bricks marked with the name of Nebuchadnezzar were reused in buildings of nearby villages. The great city became a quarry. Systematic excavations began at the end of the 19th century. When the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey initiated in the year 1899, an excavation that lasted 18 years and that for the first time revealed the plan of the city with certain precision. Koldewey was the first to identify the remains of what could have been a system of vaults associated with the legendary gardens. Although the interpretation remains controversial, his works brought to light the Ishtar Gate, the processional way in large parts of the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, the most valuable archaeological materials, including the tiles of the Ishtar Gate, were moved to Berlin, where the structure was partially reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum. The rest, what remained on the soil of Iraq, had worse fortune. The wars of the 20th century and the decades of instability that followed damaged the site in ways that archaeologists are still cataloging. During the Iraq War initiated in 2003, coalition forces built a military base over part of the archaeological site. Helicopter blades dispersed dust that contained fragments of pottery 4,000 years old. Trenches were dug through archaeological strata that had not been touched since antiquity. The damage was documented by UNESCO missions and by independent archaeologists. It was not a secret. It simply was not a priority. Today, the site of Babylon is in the municipality of Hilla, in the governorate of Babylon. about 80 kilometers south of Baghdad. It was declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in the year 2019, a late recognition that arrived after decades of deterioration. There is an in-situ museum that houses replicas and some original materials, the partial reconstruction of some structures that was done during the government of Saddam Hussein, who identified himself rhetorically with Nebuchadnezzar and ordered his name to be engraved on new bricks placed over the ancient walls, generated archaeological debate about the authenticity of what the visitor sees today. But there is something profoundly Babylonian in that too. The compulsion of every new power to insert its name into the stones of the most famous city of the ancient world. The Code of Hammurabi is available in translation on the internet. You can read it complete tonight if you want. Its principles on contracts, property, professional responsibility, and consumer protection are recognized in modern legal structures in ways that lawyers have analyzed extensively. When there exists a minimum wage regulated by the state, when a doctor has legal responsibility for his negligence, when a builder can be sued for construction defects, when a lender has legal limits on the interest rates that he can charge, you are operating within a system whose deepest roots reach that black diorite stele engraved almost 4,000 years ago in Babylon. Not as direct imitation, as convergence, as the rediscovery of solutions to problems that are constant in organized human life. And the Babylonian exile continues to be, in terms of accumulated influence, one of the most determining events of Western history. The Bible, which gave shape to European thought for more than a millennium, was in part written and compiled in Babylon. The prophecies that described the fall of arrogant imperial power were written while that imperial power existed and was irresistible. The image of Babylon, as a symbol of the pride that precedes destruction, traveled through the centuries, reached the revelation of John, reached the texts of the Puritans who founded the American colonies, reached the Jamaican Rastafarians of the 20th century who used the name of Babylon to refer to the system of colonial oppression. None of that was planned by Nebuchadnezzar. All those are unintended consequences of political decisions taken 2,600 years ago. That is what makes Babylon different from any other vanished empire. Most empires are remembered for what they built or for what they destroyed. Babylon is also remembered for that, but above all, it is remembered for the consequences it could not control, for the texts written by the people it captivated, for the laws that inspired systems that it could not have imagined, for the gardens that perhaps never existed, and which, nevertheless, appear in all the lists of wonders of the world for more than 2 millennia, for the tower that it ordered to be built to demonstrate that its builders could reach heaven, and that 3 religions converted into the eternal symbol of human arrogance. The rise of Babylon was the result of the systematic intelligence of Hammurabi, the constructive ambition of Nebuchadnezzar, and the capacity of a city to survive centuries of conquests. Keeping its identity intact, its fall was the result of something much more mundane. A king who did not appear to the correct ceremony for 10 years in a row, and who turned his own priests into allies of the enemy. Empires do not fall because of their enemies. They fall when those who are inside decide that it is no longer worth defending them. That is what Babylon learned too late, and 2,500 years after the bronze and lapis lazuli gates opened without resistance before the army of Cyrus. We continue building systems that depend on the people who are inside believing that it is worth defending them, and we continue with the same impressive regularity, finding the way to convince them that it is not.